just share the screen. Where? There. There's some scary images for those of you who are a bit scared of this kind of stuff, but I'm doing it anyway. Okay, now in an article titled "Why We Need Dragons, the Progressive Potential of Fantasy," Daniel Barker explains fantasy's increasing presence in the marketplace not only indicates the genre's aesthetic power, but it also alerts us to the exciting possibilities of the social role that fantasy can perform. What I'd like to do in this talk is to consider the idea of fantasy's social role by looking at the dialogue that's developed between pandemic media, so films and TV shows and also social media, and the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year and a half. In looking at this, I also want to especially examine how memes were virally infecting social media in parallel with the coronavirus of humans in the real world especially last year. Specifically, the memes I'll be looking at drew upon iconic conventions, images, and sounds from examples of pandemic media, especially zombie films and TV shows, in order to comment seriously, critically, or comically on the pandemic and social responses to it. Hang on. I'm especially interested in how the social imaginary that's rehearsed in film and television can be a powerful a powerful discursive tool. In broad terms, the social imaginary is how people make sense of their collective social life. Charles Taylor argues that the social imaginary involves the ways that people imagine their social existence. And Gonkar also explains social imaginaries are ways of understanding the social that become entities in themselves, mediating collective life. They're embedded in the habitus of the population or are carried in modes of address, stories, symbols. They are the means by which individuals understand their identities and their place in the world. The more I followed news stories and social media, the more I wanted to understand how narrative media dealing with...
Hey, Google.
Sorry? Oh. Dealing with... no, I've lost my place. With fantasy pandemic scenarios became a significant form of communication during this pandemic period. Contagion, 28 Days Later, World War Z, Train to Busan, I'm Legend, The Walking Dead, and so many other examples are popular and familiar stories about pandemics that are embedded in the minds of millions of people. Their narratives raise questions about what happens to society, its ethics and morality, its political and social structures, its health services, its communities, its scientific communities during pandemics. During the first year of the coronavirus, what became obvious is how these examples took center stage in mediating collective life on a global scale. From a film and TV perspective, Contagion, 28 Days Later, Walking Dead are popular and familiar stories about pandemics that are embedded in and give expression to our social imaginary. And here's an image from, there's a few images from Contagion. These examples draw upon events in real life. For example, the SARS virus in the case of Contagion, and Mark's written a few excellent articles on this too, and narrativise them in fantasy settings, in the process giving voice to the social imaginary that's being told about viral contagion and the consequences of human tampering through, for example, genetics or biowarfare and so on, that's seen as potentially leading to apocalyptic scenarios. Sorry, that jumped ahead on its own, magically. Scenarios that can bring about the destruction of humanity. Let me just take that back, but it's bloody stuck, for God's sake. There we go. Media have become an important to people during this period of isolation. People are accessing media to stay informed, but they're also turned to Netflix, Foxtel, Amazon Prime, and so on to consume narratives. In terms of viewing pandemic media, according to Google Trends, the month of March 2020 recorded sudden spikes in the searches for films about pandemics and viral outbreaks. The most watched has been the 2011 film Contagion, which is about a deadly viral pandemic, for those of you who haven't seen it, and has eerie parallels with what we're experiencing now, even though it was influenced by the SARS virus. And what's also interesting is this image in the center of the bodies being buried was actually circulating on social media as bodies being buried in China during the real pandemic. Contagion rose from 270th most watched film for Warner Brothers to the second most watched film on Netflix in March 2020. Similar spikes have happened with other pandemic films, especially zombie ones. I Am Legend, the Romero Living Dead films, the Zack Snyder reboots, Shaun of the Dead, and so on. Perhaps they've become an outlet for playing through our fears about the virus in horrifying but safe ways. News media also caught on to this, and there were numerous stories in journals and in the news about the best pandemic films to sit down and watch in your spare time while in lockdown. And amidst this, there's also a lot of media fear-mongering, like this one, which relies on scare tactics that force the idea of the infiltration of fantasy into reality. Fairy tale scholar, hang on, there I am. Fairy tale scholar Zach Snipes has stated that it's through fantasy that we have always sought to make sense of the world, not through reason. Reason matters, but fantasy matters more. It's through the fictive projections of our imaginations based on personal experience that we have sought to grasp, explain, alter, and comment on reality. Reflecting this sentiment, Scrivener also offers an explanation of the function of zombie films, which are one of the most popular and prolific examples of pandemic media. It's explaining that the premise of both 28 Days Later and The Walking Dead is what happens to humans individually and society more broadly during a dangerous viral outbreak. These fictions are excellent simulations for understanding the dynamics of viral pandemics, he says. And many of these films and TV shows, in fact, criticize humans and their collective responses more than they criticize the actual zombies, the victims of the pandemic that has been caused by all sorts of various explanations. Charles Taylor argues that if we're attempting to understand what is presently occurring in society, we need to grasp at least some of the images, stories, and legends that circulate within that group, and they're deployed by people in imagining their larger society. Now, I wanted to look at this now by turning to how people responded to these events and to these using images and stories taken from pandemic media, but applying them to new contexts of social media and memes that became viral. Now, one of these patterns has to do with the zombie meme being used to critique real behaviors. And here you see, I don't know how many of you remember this, but it was pretty widely distributed. On the 16th of April, 2020, at the Columbus Dispatch, the paper published this story, and it included this image by Joshua A. Bickle of protesters above, you see on the left, crammed at a department store, trying to break in and protesting against the lockdown orders and all the orders for mask wearing and so on that had been circulated. And it didn't take long for fans of these sort of examples of pandemic media to compare the scenes to examples like at the bottom left you see Shaun of the Dead, and to the right you see it being compared to Romero's Dawn of the Dead in particular. And these memes went viral. All sorts of variations of them were being circulated. And what's a common theme in the zombie genre is that humans are exposed as being more zombie-like in their behavior, and they lack social skills and morals than the actual zombies. And this is exactly what starts to circulate, the message that circulates in these images that are being repeated. Let me just, I hope the sound to this works.
Oh, Lord. This fucking I Am Legend. That bitch
All right,
Oh, Lord.
I better stop her because she keeps on coming. Again, it's the anti-masker's behavior that's regarded as zombie-like by people who were taking this video. I don't know if you heard, but the guy taking it said, oh, it's from I Am Legend, the other zombie-like film. Okay. The second type are memes that use pandemic films and repurpose them for the coronavirus, often using comedy to reflect on the differences between fantasy and reality. And here they're reimagining Will Smith's character. Oh, for God's sake. There we go. Will Smith's character from I Am Legend, as if he were having to go through what we were going through and still are going through, going to the supermarket. And here there are many variants of this one using different stars and different films. And the observation is that with regret, during our own apocalypse that we're going through less heroic and more mundane kind of experiences compared to Buffy and Mel Gibson's character in the Mad Max films. Or this one, South Park down the bottom, and oh gosh, I've just forgotten the name of the film with Viggo Mortensen. Oh well, temporary lapse of brain there. And one of my favorites, I have to say, is these kind of huge size, larger size posts that were both on social media and in real life, scattered across the US and in Australia, where they regret that we got this apocalypse and didn't get the full-on zombie one, which was far more exciting. The third example I want to focus on is the comical shaming of human responses dealing with the reality of the everyday pandemic. And one of the most carnivalesque of all has been the memes about toilet paper. And this is how Australians protect themselves against coronavirus. This is from last year, around March, April, when the hysteria started. And this is another one. It's a bit fuzzy, but it's wads of toilet paper, and you'll notice the theme music is straight out of The Walking Dead. It really, once you add the music, it really looks like a bunch of Walking Dead taking their toilet paper. And TV shows like The Walking Dead were favorites for this sort of thing. Come on. And the final popular meme theme was that the COVID-19 would morph into something else that echoes this kind of superbug idea. We'd move beyond it. And that's interesting to think about, especially now with the Delta variant that's going on. Christopher explains that the concept of the meme, conceived as the cultural equivalent of the biological gene by Richard Dawkins, spread through culture like a virus, quickly and widely. Memes emerge at moments of contestation of dominant narratives, and through their participatory structure of imitation and mutation, they allow for the dissolution of points of ideological conflict, as well as for the re-establishment of a normative narrative. These pandemic memes operated like this, contesting dominant narratives and also exposing ideologies. But so far, I haven't been able to locate any normative narratives that have emerged. Despite limitations of film production last year, later in the year, and especially this year, a few more films and TV shows began production that dealt more directly with the pandemic as we've been experienced. And I might end by showing, just talking briefly about some of the examples that have been released. One is called Corona, Fear is a Virus, and it's a Canadian film that involves a group of people who are trapped in an elevator during the COVID pandemic. And it's a serious one. It sort of brings out the dramas of human beings in that situation. And on the right is Corona Zombies, which is more kind of comical take on the virus. The other interesting one, I think, is Slowborn, a recent German-Danish co-production, which is set on an island, and there are people coming in on a boat who are infected with a virus. In this case, it's a bird disseminated flu virus, but it obviously reflects our times, and they thought it was too close to home. More recently, we've had Songbird, which is basically a love story, because it was filmed during a time when on-location shooting was very limited, and it's produced by Michael Bay. And the film looks at how the pandemic impacts on society 2 years down the track. And a new strain has developed called COVID-23, and it's a super strain that attacks the brain, and Americans are forced into mass quarantine camps. The military comes into the picture. So it sort of really ups the ante on what's going on now. And what's interesting, in many of these new science fiction projections of the virus into the not too distant future, is the key theme has to do with suppression of individual rights and the introduction of martial law. And there's going to be so many more coming out. So it'll be interesting to see what direction they'll go in. And the most recent one that I'll end with is The Bite. I don't know if any of you have seen this. It's on the new streaming service, the Paramount service. And it's a kind of serious comedy, American TV series produced by Robert and Michelle King, who are responsible for The Good Wife and The Good Fight and Brain Dead. And again, it introduces the idea of a new strain of the coronavirus. It's while people are in lockdown, so there's a lot of familiar stuff. Your regular video messages from the CDC and the American government, but takes it to that other extreme, and people with this new strand turn into zombies. And there are many familiar features. There's the emphasis, as I said, of lockdowns, of non-believers, and instead of anti-vaxxers, you've got the anti-zombie believers in this. And at the end, sorry to give it away, but the cure that they discover is bleach. It includes bleach anyway. So to wrap up, Castoriadis argues that the imaginary of society creates for each historical period its singular way of living, seeing, and making its own existence. And I think that these pandemic media are doing just this. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing.